Hello and welcome. I'm Yvonne Chan in Singapore, and you're watching FIA Dialogues. Thank you for joining us on the final day of FIA Dialogues. This week, we've had in-depth interviews and panel discussions about the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities in the food and beverage industry. In this edition of Dialogues, we'll be talking about food loss and food waste and strategies to redesign food production to halve global food wastage by 2030. But before we delve into this topic, you will hear from a number of our industry leaders about their thoughts on the food industry and some of the key issues and challenges as we all navigate these unprecedented times. And finally, we thank our sponsors, Corteva, Danone, Kerry, and Mondelez for their generous support in making this event possible. But first, reporter Greg Ward speaks with Anita Neville, Senior Vice President, Communications with Golden Agri-Resources.
So much focus recently on the need for FMCGs to become more resilient. For you, what does that term even mean, resilient?
I think it's such an interesting question because I think FMCGs are, by definition, resilient. We have to be in order to feed the world and its ever increasing demands. For our business, fundamentally it's been about vertically integrating our operations. Golden Agri-Resources is or was initially a palm oil plantation company. We've since expanded to cover all aspects of palm-based production from seed to shelf. And so resilience has sort of been built into the DNA of our business over the last decade or so. Right now, that's been a focus on our people and how to make sure that our people are fine. Supply chain, how do we work with suppliers to make sure that they're doing what they need to in this pandemic?
Could you tell us more about how you're managing to improve, hopefully, your business, bearing in mind the lessons you've learned from COVID-19?
Our business kind of sits in this interesting space because palm oil is such a fundamental ingredient in so many things, from noodles, instant noodles, which we sell out of our operation in China, cooking oil, which is a basic in Southeast Asia, through a whole myriad of baked goods, etc. But also it's had a really, palm-based oleochemicals have a really important role to play in personal care and hygiene products. So your hand sanitizers, your personal soaps, those liquid soaps. So we've had a really interesting experience because in many cases through this period, our primary focus has been how to meet the demands of brand manufacturers and retailers who are looking for ingredients to support products that have been in high demand through global lockdowns. So we've heard about all the runs on toilet paper. Well, there's equally been obviously runs on things like hand sanitizers or wet wipes and liquid soaps. And so to be able to respond rapidly to our customers' need to get those ingredients where they need them, when they need them, so that they can cope with end user demand has been kind of a really big challenge for us. And that's been a lot of focus on logistics and distribution.
Global food demand is expected to double by 2050, which is an extraordinary amount. What challenges does that present to you, and how will you respond?
I think it presents an opportunity for the palm oil sector. Whilst we have a terrible name, it is still the most efficient oil per hectare in terms of crop and yield production. And it's also a very versatile commodity. So I mentioned our R&D facility in Marunda. We can develop products that replace cocoa butters or mimic those mouthfeels for certain kinds of production methods, particularly those people making chocolate here in Asia Pac, where the weather isn't kind to chocolate if you want to keep it from melting in your hand. We're also seeing plant-based innovations in terms of products, and there's an opportunity for palm oil, which carries nutrition and vitamin fortification well, to really add value to food products. So as we look for both more food, but also better food and nutritionally dense food, I think the palm oil sector has a really important role to play there to provide a vehicle to deliver those nutrients to a growing population.
Those plant alternatives, that sounds really interesting. From a consumer's point of view, what might we see on the shelves in years to come?
Oh, I think everything from kind of, obviously we've already seen the sort of beyond meats, impossible foods type applications, and I think we'll see that at an increasing scale and at a more affordable price point, because at the moment that still sits outside of the reach of many people. I think you'll also see, and this is something that we've been working with in our China business alongside our Indonesian food tech developers, is nutritionally valid energy foods, so rethinking energy bars and those kinds of foods. Protein powders obviously been really big in the wellness and lifestyle sort of gym junkie industry. But beyond that, I think we're going to see alternatives to a whole range of products that we've become accustomed to in our diet, where we want to look at less environmentally intensive options to produce the same kind of experience. So dairy alternatives is an obvious choice.
In the news today, the World Health Organization indicated that we may have to live with COVID-19 for 5 years, a much longer expectation than previously thought. What impact will that have on your efforts to innovate and to meet that huge global demand for food?
So I think first and foremost, we have to think about how we care for our people, because I know that many of us are struggling through this period of lockdown, separation, and uncertainty. And from a business perspective, we have an obligation to make sure that we're caring for our people. Beyond that, to answer your bigger question, how do we serve the needs of the world if we are in these more constrained circumstances, from our home offices or bedrooms, whatever it may be? I think it's going to be a lot about rapid uptake of technological advancement and seeing how that can be utilized to minimize risk to people coming into contact with the disease. Ruthless focus on food safety, hygiene, and sanitation is going to be really essential. We see that within our own operations, just anecdotally, since we've been imposing COVID level safety and personal hygiene focus. We've also seen a reduction in days off sick in certain refinery areas, for example, off the back of things like diarrhea or other fevers and temperatures, things that are quite common in the tropics, which are being eliminated by this rigorous focus on personal hygiene, washing hands, etc. And then finally, I think at a global level, there will need to be some kind of recalibration of what wealth and value looks like. We've heard reports, I think this morning, not just about what the WHO is saying, but also about the prospect for significant economic losses and, a shrinkage of global GDP. None of us have an understanding at this point what that's going to mean for everyday lives, and particularly for the poorest amongst us. And we work in some of the poorest rural communities in Indonesia. We have an obligation also to think through how do we create value in those communities so that they also have food security and food safety in a way that we take for granted sitting somewhere like Singapore.
And now, let's also get the perspective of Christian Hansen's Regional Vice President for the Asia Pacific, Thomas Reiner.
What are the main sustainability challenges you are expecting in the year or two ahead?
I need to start with that one. We as a company have a very, very clear and defined purpose. The purpose is that we want to address global challenges by advancing food, health, and productivity. We see, and there are many, many challenges in the world, but I want to concentrate on those we can address from our company. And these three challenges are mainly sustainable farming, how can we make farming more sustainable? The world population will increase significantly. We need to increase our productivity. So I don't think we will make it with an extensive farming. We need to have an intense farming, but we can't put pesticide and nematicide on the soil, which will prevail for the future of our children. We have a second theme, which is quite important. It's the theme of antibiotic resistance. About 33,000 people are dying right now per year in Europe on an issue with antibiotic resistance. The WHO foresees for the year 2050 that it will be 10 million worldwide. So antibiotic resistance is a big issue. And the last issue is, if we produce more food, the big challenge is 1/3 of all food is wasted.
So 3 big issues there. What are you doing to address those issues?
We have 3 very, very defined sustainability targets. Target number 1 is better farming. We apply our bacteria. We do bacteria. Just to give you an example, an evident example, this is the bacteria which you put into to make 10,000 cups of yogurt. It's a small amount, but extremely powerful. So we use our bacteria to make farming better. Instead of using nematicide and pesticide, we apply bacteria on the field. Let's look at the second theme. It's good health, or replacing antibiotics. We have bacteria which can replace antibiotics by the impact of the probiotic. It's just a different theme. Antibiotics kills the bacteria of your intestine. The probiotic brings a positive power into your intestine, and you don't need antibiotics. So what we do, both in the animal farming and on the human health, we apply probiotics to prevent that they need antibiotics. The last theme is we want to have less waste. As I said before, 1/3 of food is wasted. So we have relatively powerful concepts. One is a concept to prevent yeast and mold. Yeast and mold prevention means we have bacteria which, so to say, eat the minerals which the yeast and mold needs before they grow. And that means at the very end, yeast and mold have no chance to grow. We can enhance the shelf life of a yogurt by 10 days.
Well, adding 10 days to the life of the yogurt sounds a great idea. Is the market ready for that, though? Will there be any consumer concern about that?
The market is ready for it because it has 3 dimensions. It has a dimension at the producer, because the producer can be a little bit more flexible with his production pattern. The second element is in the retail. If the retail can keep the yogurt a bit longer before wasting it away, he is creating value. And the third value happens at the consumer side, because the consumer, how often have you probably wasted a yogurt which was just out of shelf life, but the consumer will get a little bit more shelf life, and with this more of shelf life, he will not throw it away.
And that figure of food demand, global food demand, expecting to double by 2050, that's extraordinary. How can you respond to that?
Well, that's a bit of a repetition what I already said, because exactly this is a theme we have on our scope. We have, our purpose is to deliver natural, innovative solutions that address global challenges by advancing food, health, and productivity. Our big themes we have on scope is better farming, good health, and less waste. This is our big themes. And proudly we say 82% of our revenue is contributing to 3 UN goals in terms of sustainability.
Before we go, did you have any closing comments or message to the audience?
My personal empathy goes with the power of the good bacteria. Why is that? I have been with the company almost 30 years, I've been very, very long with the company, and you could say, well, it doesn't sound very sexy on one side. On the other side, I'm just fascinated what bacteria can do. And I think there's a big leverage for the years to come on the bacteria side. And that is both on health and on the side of sustainability and on the side of taste and texture.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to hear from two of our leaders to better understand the challenges and opportunities that they currently see across the sector. FIA's Food for the Future TV series launches on August 12, and during 4 special episodes, we talk to industry leaders and deliver news-style reports on the latest developments in innovation, health and nutrition, resilience, and sustainability. Here's a short preview.
Which industries would you identify as the ones that are facing big opportunities as a result of COVID-19?
Any company has an ability to take advantage of a situation like this or to grow in a situation like this if they're able to pivot, to adjust, to innovate in this space. So that's something that we see as really important, and that's why I think market intelligence is sort of that key aspect there, because we can provide them with the data, with the understanding of how the consumers are behaving, and being able to really target that area.
Congestion. It's part of our modern lives. But bottlenecks are never welcome, especially in food and beverage manufacturing, where blockages in production can be disastrous. An enterprise resource planning system, or ERP, can help overcome the most complex production roadblocks.
Effectively, an ERP system can integrate everything from planning to purchasing, to inventory, to sales. It really is critical.
Cispro says its software is easy to use but powerful enough to give businesses a 360-degree view of their operations, enabling them to avoid the bottlenecks that can literally choke a business.
But now it's time for the first of our panel sessions, Food Loss and Food Waste, redesigning food production to halve global food wastage by 2030. Greg Ward is standing by with our panelists.
Thank you, Yvonne. Welcome now to our panel discussion on food loss. And joining us today are Richard Ruddy from Lazada, Alan Adams from Sealed Air, and Yulanda Chung from DBS. Yulanda, let's begin with you. How big is the problem of food loss and waste, and why does it matter to you and your organisation?
So this year, DBS has actually embarked on a campaign to aim for zero food waste. And we started doing a lot of research and investigations into the topic from last year. And once we scratched the surface and have read up on a lot of the literature, the topic is actually really, really relevant for Asia, because over half of the world's food loss, that is food loss in the supply chain, and food waste, which is food that is unconsumed, uncooked on the table, actually occurs in Asia. So when that statistics jumped out at us, we thought that this is a topic that we could mobilize our employees, we can engage with our clients, and we decided to zero in on the topic.
Alan, let's hear your perspective. How big is the problem and why does it concern your organisation?
Look, as you heard from Yulanda, the problem is massive, and interestingly, it's growing as we develop and our lifestyles are changing. Food waste is actually on the increase, partly because of our lifestyle choices. For our organisation, well, we're in business to protect, to solve critical packaging challenges, and to leave the world a better place than we found it. And given that more than half of our business is focused on fresh food packaging, it's incredibly important. And we believe strongly that the industry has a lot of opportunity and requirement actually to reduce food waste. And we think packaging has a major part to play in reducing food waste. As many global organizations and countries have targets like reducing food waste by half by 2030, for example.
Richard, you just heard Alan say there are opportunities to do something about it. What are your thoughts? How big do you see the problem and how concerned are you?
Well, I think for me as a principally a food retailer, it's a big issue. That there's a number of different aspects to it that I see. Firstly, from a customer perspective, obviously we have a large customer base who are procuring products from our platform and also consuming those products at home. So we have a responsibility there to help to educate that aspect of it. So from a customer side, from a pure economic side, from a business scale, reducing waste is important from that aspect too. And then finally it's just our duty to the environment and to the ecosystem from an environmental perspective. So we want to be as efficient with that food supply from source to consumption. So for me, there's three aspects to it, which I'm very keen to keep addressing. Of the three, which is the customer aspect of it, which is about educating for consumption. The second one, which is about the economic impact for waste generally, both for my business but also for the wider industry, but also on thirdly, the environmental impact. As a food retailer, we're part of a bigger ecosystem. So my responsibility as a food retailer is to play my part to improve the efficiency of that from growing and from sourcing all the way through to consumption.
Let's look now at the existing measures to curb food wastage. Yulanda, where do you think the gaps can be found in the current measures?
For the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of credit facilities called the sustainability linked loans, and we've been using that instrument to nudge and incentivize customers to do better. So when you talk about gaps in the value chain from food production all the way to food on the table, we see that there are opportunities every step of the way, and we can weave the environmental and social factors, the improvements into the value chain. We have done a sustainability linked loan, for example, for an egg producer here in Singapore called Chills Agriculture. And the company was very ambitious to acquire a certification called Humane Care, which is to produce cage-free eggs. So the push for them is not just from us at DBS providing capital on certain environmental conditions. The push also comes from their buyers because they supply to many of the big food and beverage establishments, and they all want to start buying cage-free eggs. And DBS role here is to incentivize them by offering a discount on the interest margin when they acquire the certification, which is not an easy certification to acquire. So for banks, I think we do follow and are guided by our customers' innovation, but we do see that the gaps in the value chain, the best way to tackle it is to speak to the industry practitioners.
Alan, a good example there of cage-free eggs. What about you? Can you identify any solutions to get us closer to the 2030 target?
There's a raft of opportunities, really, and while there are so many gaps, a lot of opportunities are related to how do we tackle the key challenges. And I see that two broad areas. We can split food waste and into two categories, into food losses and food waste. As was spoken about earlier, in the losses space, it's about looking at supply chain efficiency and performance. So extending shelf life, more robust systems, opportunities for developing more cold chain consistency and efficiency is important for tackling those losses challenges. At the waste level, at the consumer level of waste, we have a whole lot of opportunities around educating consumers in their behaviours, and some of the things that can fit into that, where I think packaging has a part to play, is through education. So packaging and on-packaging messaging can carry things like how to use the food properly, from storage consistency, from easy access features, from making things ready for in-home storage, be it freezer or otherwise, accurate cooking instructions. And even we're seeing in some countries developing globally instructions around how to use leftovers after the meal's completed and not everything's consumed. All of these types of things can be carried on packaging. A significant problem that still exists is use by and sell by dates. The confusion around those is still causing unnecessary waste.
Richard, Alan has just highlighted greater efficiencies and education as a couple of options. Do you have anything to add in terms of solutions for the problem?
Consumer education is really vital to me as part of this overarching kind of challenge. And if I consider things like shelf life, Alan's touched on that already. There's a big area of misconception with shelf life, and I think as consumers, as a retailer, we're working very closely with our marketing teams to be able to make sure customers understand what that means. That actually the fact that a product is approaching its shelf life means it's perfectly fine to consume. Also, just stepping out into other product categories like vegetables and produce, for example, there's a responsibility as a retailer to work with the growers and the farmers to say, actually, it's okay that wonky veg, slightly off-grade product is still perfectly fine to consume from a nutritional value perspective, but actually, as a retailer, we're willing to buy that product to stop the food waste at source. And then kind of moving forward more onto the education part for consumers at home. If I look at products like bananas, for example, we work very closely to communicate the fact that bananas that have got slightly brown spots, again, are perfectly fine to consume. In fact, they're a little bit sweeter. They're great for smoothies, etc., and for baking. A lot of consumers feel that a banana with a brown spot is not ready to consume and is actually bad. So there's a lot of education that we're working on in the consumer angle, but also working backwards in the supply chain with our sources and our growers and our farmers is about how do we work on packaging solutions. So again, as Alan's mentioned there, how do we get a more efficient packaging that can maintain and preserve shelf life in that journey through the supply chain journey from source to the retailer. And that can be packaging, that can be also natural preservatives that we've seen in some areas of produce where actual natural coatings are becoming quite popular now and more readily available. And if you look back at kind of history, wax coatings of lemons or preservatives of products has been around for centuries. So we need to bring that into the modern age.
Well, food loss and food waste are obviously a global problem. Yulanda, what role do you think financial institutions have to play in combating the problem?
So through our DBS Foundation, we supported a lot of social enterprises over the past 6 years, in fact. And a couple of years ago, we supported this social enterprise called Tree Dots. And what Tree Dots does is to create an online platform to link businesses with unsold inventory to potential buyers to prevent perfectly edible food from ending up in the bin. And Tree Dots platform combines and matches the food producers, importers, distributors, food and beverage venues to facilitate the selling of unsold food items to the right buyers. And with a lot of the data being collected and the analytics that go on, they can really enhance the efficiency of food distribution. So the grant that we provided them was specifically used to enhance their online platform. That's one example. Another social enterprise that we've supported and we felt very proud what they've achieved since is Edible Garden City. And Edible Garden City is a company whose mission is to grow your own food. And in Singapore, space is scarce, of underutilized spaces, whether it is rooftops or under the viaduct, and to help hospitals, hotels, schools, private companies to grow their own food. And we know that if the source of food is close to you, you are also able to reduce food loss and food waste along the way.
Let's turn now to packaging. Alan, bring us up to date. How has packaging design evolved over the past decade to keep food well protected and preserved?
a great question, and a lot has happened in the last decade. I think the key drivers for packaging design over the last decade have really been around our changing lifestyles and around the globalization of tastes and experiences that consumers want. And packaging design has evolved also to fit with our modern lifestyles of eating on the go. Things like providing convenient access, convenient storage, microwave in the packaging, so ready to cook or eat meals in the packaging. These things have been developed to enable more convenience and to enable us to have the lifestyles we want.
And Alan, what has been the impact of, say, e-commerce?
Actually, e-commerce has had a massive impact, and we've had to design new packaging for it. Packaging that delivers a protection through the e-commerce supply chain, which is more convoluted than traditional supply chains and different, but also the environmental impacts, as there's a concern about their additional additional packaging being generated.
What for you remain the biggest obstacles to overcoming Asia's food waste challenge?
Good question. Look, food waste is a substantial challenge, not just in Asia, but globally. It generates, as it decomposes, a lot of greenhouse gases. In fact, globally, food waste, if it were a country, would be the ranked third highest generator of greenhouse gases in the world, behind only the US and China. So, I think some of the things that we need real innovation in are, and some of these great projects that are coming through are things like the Sustainable Rice Platform, where a project has been generated to work with farmers to reduce on-farm waste and near-farm waste of rice and cut it in half by 2030. Now, that's such an important project because 1 in 6 calories globally is in the form of rice. So getting that right's incredible. And I know we've heard about this a couple of times already today, but consumer education is critical. Consumer behaviours need to change, and we need to help them understand how to get what the cost of food waste and also get better outcomes.
Richard, I imagine you would share most of those sentiments. Is there anything you'd like to add about the challenges that food e-commerce will have to overcome?
Yeah, I do. I echo and agree with a lot of those comments. I think as e-commerce increases its share of overall grocery market, which it's forecast to do quite strongly in the coming years, the COVID crisis to one side for a second, I think the challenges that e-commerce has are a little different than traditional bricks and mortar retailing. So if I look at fresh food, for example, fresh food is very difficult to do in retail generally, but it's even harder to do in e-commerce for a number of reasons. If you look at the typical customer journey, the purchase pattern in store versus online, it's very, very different. And there are a lot of barriers to buying, like the perishable goods, for example. So as an e-commerce player, we have to balance a number of these considerations. So shelf life is a very big consideration, and quality. So if you imagine in store when you're buying when you're selecting your produce, you're very choosy. You go through, you rummage around, you pick the ones that are the right shade, the right size specifically for yourself. If you're picking a pre-packed product, you go to the back of the chiller to pick the one with the best shelf life, for example. So as an online retailer, we have to do that job for you, for the customer. So our systems and our processes are very geared towards ensuring consistency of shelf life, ensuring consistency of quality, and that's quality all the way through from our inbound goods receiving all the way through to the last mile delivery to the customer's fridge. And we give our customers a shelf life guarantee or a shelf life promise of a product. So we want to give the customers the assurance that a product we deliver today will be good to use for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 days, depending on the type of product. So that puts an additional pressure on the supply chain function we have, where we need to make sure our stock rotation and our stock purchasing is super efficient, because I want to limit the amount of time a product sits in our supply chain to maximize the amount of shelf life the customer has. So again, a lot of that is driven by our data and how we manage the data, and I think we're very accurate in what we do, and that I think that's the advantage we have as an online player. And actually, I feel our supply chain is actually shorter. So in a lot of cases, our perishable goods come into our supply chain in the morning and they're delivered to the customer doorstep that same day. So that's actually much shorter than the traditional bricks and mortar when you consider it that way. So I think as a retailer, from an online perspective, I think we've got the ability to reduce that shelf life, and I think that's a key competitive advantage that is now coming through with the recent COVID crisis, that customers are now understanding, appreciating that actually online groceries has got a competitive advantage and actually an overall better customer experience.
Richard, you've mentioned the value of data and forecasting. Are there any other specific measures you've taken to meet the rising demand from consumers, but continuing to keep food wastage low? Any other specific measures?
We work very closely with our growers and with our suppliers. So we have to make sure that with the growing sales and the growing demand, that actually that the supply and the source is there at the optimum quality. So we share, as I say, we share that data very closely. But we also do a lot of value stream mapping with our supply partners to make sure that every aspect and every touch point along the supply chain is optimized, and any shelf life benefits are taken, and that can be anything from packaging all the way through to the physical logistics and movement aspects of it. So we are very detailed in what we do from that value stream mapping.
Well, that wraps up today's panel discussion on food loss and food waste. Once again, thank you, Richard, Alan and Yulanda, and good luck for your future efforts to make an impact. Now back to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to our panelists. Shortly, we'll be crossing to our live Q&A session, where an expert panel is standing by to answer your questions about food loss and food waste. It's easy to send us your questions at any time. Just type your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of the YouTube live stream, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. The moderator for this session is co-founder and director of Alpha Beta, Fraser Thompson. Thank you, Fraser. It's over to you.
Thank you, Yvonne, and welcome everyone to this panel on tackling food waste. Now, we saw in the videos that you've just seen that the challenge that we face in food waste and the fact that it's only going to get worse with this growing consuming class, particularly here in Asia. So it's exciting to have this panel where we've got a group of terrific panelists from around the world who are doing really innovative things around tackling food waste. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce them and then ask them to tell us a little bit about what they're doing. Then I'll ask them a few questions, and then we're going to throw out to the audience to get some of your questions. And it's great to see already how many questions we're coming through. So let's jump straight into it. And let me introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Tanmay Bhargava. He's the head of Asia Pacific for Intello Labs. And Intello basically provides a new approach to evaluate fresh produce quality with AI-driven imagery, multispectral and acoustic technologies. Next, we have Aidan Mouat joining us from the US. And Aidan is the CEO and co-founder of Hazel Technologies, which is a post-harvest crop protection company making biochemical solutions to extend product life. And finally, we have Alan Adams from Sealed Air Packaging. Based in Melbourne, Alan is leading the customer and packaging industry engagement for Sealed Air in the Asia Pacific region. So what I'd like to do is just ask each of our panelists to just give us if you like, a 30-second snapshot of what's the technology that they're bringing to the market that is trying to tackle food waste. And maybe, Alan, if I could throw to you first to give us an overview.
Thanks, Fraser. Well, I'm at Sealed Air, and our food division, the Cryovac brand food packaging, is integral with food supply chains. You know, it's our technologies that founded and delivered the kind of supply chains that allow us to have fresh proteins any time of the year, anywhere in the world virtually today. And I think the importance of packaging in food supply chain and its impact on food waste is dramatic. our opportunity has been over decades to improve supply chains and improve reach. And we have been good at reducing food losses through the supply chain because there's a cost to that. And so packaging systems have been incrementally advanced to help that supply chain be efficient and effective. But what I'm really excited about now is that we're beginning to recognise the high level of food waste that's generated at food service and in consumer homes. And I think there's a real opportunity around packaging design with features that can enable better outcomes inside consumers' homes and start tackling that piece of food waste, which is one of the biggest. Thanks, Fraser.
Terrific. Thanks, Alan. Now, through you, Tanmay, can you tell us a little bit about Intello Labs and what you're doing to tackle food waste?
Sure, Fraser. Hey. So Intello Labs is an AI company, and we apply deep learning algorithms to images of fresh produce, images and then hyperspectral imagery and also now sound to tell the grade and quality of fresh produce as it moves through the supply chain of various companies such as supermarket chains, e-commerce companies, food processing companies, and also aggregators. And we provide them with the information and some interventions to make sure that the food reaches its right destination and that they have the right set of information to make decisions in their supply chain optimization. And then in addition to that, for some supermarket chains, we also enable in-store strategies to ensure that there is minimal dump after the inventory is not sold at the end of the day.
Terrific. Thanks, Tanmay. And Aidan, can you tell us a little bit about what Hazel Technologies is doing in the food waste area?
Absolutely. So at Hazel, we make active packaging materials and other packaging insert products that leverage a proprietary biotechnology platform that we've developed to extend the shelf life of perishables. So what we do on the core level is we take naturally occurring materials, things like sand and dirt and ash. We chemically engineer them to be able to store and time release bioactive vapors into the storage atmosphere of produce. And so by using these types of activated packaging inserts and materials, our customers are able to extend the shelf life of their perishable foods by up to 3-fold during storage and transit without any additional chemicals touching the food supply, no new residues, no new anything on the actual food itself, purely through the control of the atmosphere. So we're very interested in functionalizing storage space and using that as a platform by which to eliminate spoilage and thereby food waste in the supply chain.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone. Alan, starting with you, could you tell us, you focus on designing out food waste. Why do you focus on this stage of the value chain, and why do you think it's particularly important for tackling food waste?
Look, the opportunities for reducing food waste in homes has a lot to do with design and the packaging. We focus on that because the food in of itself is set, a steak is a steak, and mince is mince, etc. So by using packaging to deliver outcomes further down the supply chain, we can tackle waste in many ways by enabling things like consumers to enjoy the product, have a good eating experience, but it also to fit with their lifestyles. And by that I mean not just how they live, but where they live. So we've seen through recent circumstances a great increase in eating at home and the need to visit grocery stores and have deliveries of food at home. So we're needing to see concepts like food storage done well, like portion control done well, like convenience and access to all contents of packaging done well. Without those, we're just losing.
Terrific. Thank you. Now, Tanmay, if I could switch to you, and let's get into some of the more sort of pointed questions here. And your technology, this AI technology to screen out food waste, can that not actually exacerbate food waste by screening out food that would otherwise be edible?
Thanks, Fraser. That's a great question. So, so there are two aspects of looking at it. So you're right, absolutely right, that our technology essentially tells the right quality and grade of a fresh produce. And then in a way, if it does not meet the requirements of the end user, we stop it from going forward. But at the same time, we enable alternative uses of that fresh produce. So it's a fact, and we have seen it across our various engagements, is that the earlier in the supply chain, an inferior, or I should say inappropriate quality of food item is screened and taken out, the less wastage there is later in the supply chain, because the earlier you find that bad item, the easier it is for you to find an alternative use for it. So for example, if let's say we are talking about apples, so if there's a bad apple, it can be taken out at the farm gate itself. It can then go to a local a farmer's market, or it can go to a food processing unit, as compared to entering a supply chain of a supermarket, wherein it is anyways going to be wasted, right?
Interesting. So actually, the key is to early detection, so then you have the better chance of repurposing that food.
Precisely.
Now, look, sticking to the controversial questions, and Aidan, over to you. You talk about sustainable chemistry products and how that can extend food waste. As soon as we start talking about chemicals, we start entering this debate between organic versus non-organic, and to what degree we should be concerned, and is there a trade-off? What's your view on how we should be thinking about this debate?
I think it's. I think first of all, it's a question that requires a lot of respect, and we have to think about the fact that food fundamentally is an intimate, experience. It's something that we take inside ourselves. It's something that we share socially. So I understand completely the trepidation around the notion of there being chemistry at play in food, but I think you have to remember what really is the components of food. What is the chemical phenomena we're already dealing with, right? And I could rattle off a long list of chemicals, ethylene chief amongst them, but other things like acetone, ethyl acetate, acetylene, a number of other compounds. And you hear these words and you go, oh, those are nasty chemical words. But everything that I just described is actually a naturally occurring compound that is present in small quantities in the flesh of and the atmosphere surrounding a number of the foods that we eat. So it's inescapable that no matter how you slice the food supply chain, that you're going to end up having to deal with chemical management one way or the other. Chemistry is largely central to agriculture and the increase in production that we've seen in the 20th century that enables the current population. So what I think we need to be thinking about is how do we do it better? How do we do it safer? How do we do it more responsibly? And how do we do it in a way that serves not as a barrier to understanding for the common consumer, but as a bridge to understanding what goes into our food supply and how food goes safely from one point of production to another point of consumption. So we're here in a large way to facilitate that type of conversation.
Terrific, thanks, Ed. I'd like to talk now a bit about behaviour change, because when it comes to food waste, we hear constantly about the importance of behaviour change across the different stages of the value chain. And I remember a story from years ago about this big investment that was made by an aid agency in investing in metal silos to reduce post-harvest waste, and actually had limited impact because the farmers have been used to keeping their produce very close to them, like literally under their beds, because of worried about people stealing them, etc. And so there was just a basic fundamental flaw in really understanding the behaviour of those farmers in that case, and how to tackle food loss. I'd love to get the perspectives, and in particular maybe bring in Alan and Tanmay here about how you think about behavioural change, and to what degree you think in your stage of the value chain that you're focusing on, how crucial is it? So maybe Alan, to start with you, what are your thoughts on that?
From a end consumer perspective, I think there's three things we want to think about. First off is understanding the behaviours that are there now and trying to match processes, match our product offering with the lifestyle that people lead, so matching the behaviours that exist. If we want to change behaviour, I think the most successful programs take people on incremental steps. Large quantum change in one go tends to leave consumers behind, and they won't follow and won't adopt the processes, just as you talked about, Fraser, with the farmers. So it's important to remember we've got to take everyone on the journey, and that leads to the third part, which is education. And I think that in the space that we're playing with food waste, there are great opportunities here to match the style of packaging, moving from an industrial type of approach to packaging, which suits the supply chain, to more a lifestyle-oriented pack that suits the consumer lifestyles they behave today. How does it fit in a freezer at home? And also, we don't do enough at all of explaining to consumers the role that protection and experience generation at packaging does. And I think that education piece is lacking as well. We've got a lot to do in that space.
Interesting. So it seems, Alan, you say, look, it's this hope for like a home run in terms of swing for the fences in terms of behavioural change, maybe a bit too ambitious, and so we should plan accordingly. Tanmay, over to you. How are you thinking about behavioural change in your aspect of the value chain that you're tackling?
Yeah, great question again. So, Fraser, you touched upon the idea of behavior change at the farmer stage, right? And then Alan talked about the behavior change at the consumer level. So let me just touch upon both quickly. So I will speak about the farmers, and that relates more to food loss. So what we have seen, and especially in developing countries, both in India and Southeast Asia, is that farmers don't have the right set of information, right? To know when to harvest, first of all, especially in long life cycle crops, when to harvest, when is the right moment to capture basically the appropriate ripeness of the food item. And secondly, they don't have the resources to be able to grade and sort their produce at the farm gate itself, because if they do so, they can get more income out of their produce. And they can also do processing at early stages so that they can capture even more value out of the items which probably will not end up at the consumer's shopping cart, right? So, and at the consumer level, I think it's a well-known fact that more awareness and education needs to be created. The fact is that even though a food item may not be aesthetically pleasing, an apple may not be round enough, or like it may be small, or may have some cuts and cracks, but that doesn't make that apple inedible to eat, right? So we need to create that awareness. And also, in addition to awareness, we need to have appropriate channels for those produce which are slightly inferior, right? Because let's say if I'm okay with consuming inferior quality fresh produce, I don't have the right supermarkets near my house to be able to go and buy those. So I think that's quite important to create additional supply chains.
Thanks, Tanmay. Alan, throw back to you. I'm interested in this debate that we have, particularly at the moment, around packaging versus food waste and food loss. Now, obviously, packaging is really under the spotlight at the moment, and particularly here in Southeast Asia, we know that some of the biggest contributors to marine debris are actually countries within Southeast Asia. And so big efforts to tackle particularly plastic waste as a result of that. How do you think about this potential trade-off between packaging and food loss, and how should we be thinking about it?
Look, the challenge that the packaging industry has really is that we've developed a range of materials that deliver a bunch of outcomes we all want, but the speed and of collection, recovery, and looking after that waste resource has not kept pace. And we absolutely have to do better at that. We have to put stops in the supply line or the chain that sees packaging ending up where it should not be. But in terms of thinking about the trade-off, yeah, there absolutely is a trade-off. I've spoken already about portion sizes or packing for convenience. Often those outcomes require more packaging rather than less. But when we think about something like fresh beef or fresh poultry or cheese or any of these kinds of protein products, packaging a kilo of beef, the packaging has a resource footprint, a carbon footprint, if you like, of about a very small amount compared with the beef. The beef will probably be around about 370 times that of the packaging. So the primary job has to be to look after food. And food waste is globally one of the biggest climate change movers we have. In fact, it would rank only third behind the US and China as a country if food waste was regarded as a country for greenhouse generation. So we've got to do better at one end, but we just absolutely need packaging to deliver the better food waste outcomes.
True. Thanks, Alan. Now I'm going to throw to some of the questions that we're getting in from the audience. And first of all, thanks everyone for the list of questions that you've got coming in. We're not going to be able to go through all of them, but I thought I'd pick out a few of them to get the panelist response. And the first one actually goes to Aidan. And Aidan, there's a lot of emphasis on consumer education and consumer awareness. And there's an interesting question that raises about where should the burden lie? So how much of this should be on the responsibility of the producers versus the consumers, and what's your take on that?
Well, I mean that's a classic issue, right? Because we live in an increasingly complex world, and I think it's really implausible to suggest that everybody go out and get a degree in agri-science or a degree in biochemistry to understand all of the inputs that go into the food system. And there's quite a few. I mean, it's something very complex, internationally, globally connected. And yet something that we still have to interact with daily. I mean, agriculture is the only business on the planet that touches every human being every single day of their lives. So in many ways, it's a very central industry, despite the fact that it's been highly commercialized and highly diffused through a number of international commerce perspectives. So, my perspective as a business leader, to be completely honest, on a personal level, is that I think we have a very strong responsibility to do two things. One is to outreach to the consumer, to educate the consumer at every possible opportunity, and to make ourselves available for conversation. But frankly, that's why I'm here, and I appreciate the invite to be here because I really like being able to engage in these types of dialogues. But the other key part of that is good business practice, I think, being responsible stewards of the information, accepting the idea that the reason that consumers trust in brands, the reason they trust in technologies, is that they don't have the ability to go out and learn every single thing they possibly can about all the food they're ever going to eat. And so I think that's an incredible corporate responsibility when it comes to the producers that feed the world. We have to do better at every opportunity, and we have to be as transparent about that process as possible. So I think those are two key elements. And I guess I kind of strongly put both of those on the business side. So I guess my answer is the producers have a lot of responsibility. So I think that's my answer.
Terrific. Look, a question coming in from Matthew, and thank you, Matthew, for submitting this one. And I think I'd like to get to Alan and Tanmay to tackle this one. Matthew asks, how feasible is it for food manufacturers to reutilize food waste and transform them into value-added food products? So there seems to be a lot of academic research on these topics, but are we actually seeing commercialization of this turning into really viable business models? Tanmay, Alan, would you like to jump in on that one?
Okay, I can open with a couple of quick comments. Yeah, look, extracting value out of everything that's produced and trying to get more of crops off the farms and into supply chains where they are consumed and used in a valuable way is critical to business success, and actually translates to the overall cost of products getting all the way through to the consumer. I think that there are quite a lot of good programs out there, but there's a limited amount of consumer awareness around where food waste in the supply chain ends up. What I see as more challenging is dealing with food waste at the end of the supply chain. So within supply chain, a lot of products are actually picked up, reused, or shifted into another value chain. And I know Tanmay referenced that earlier, so you might like to expand on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. So I think there are a lot of ways in which food waste can be reused. So this question specifically talks about food waste. So let me just touch upon a couple of instances that we have seen with our clients. So one comes in the food processing industry. So fruits like tomatoes when they're used for making juices or purees, or pineapples when they're used for making juices or concentrates. There is an extraction value essentially. So basically, let's say if you're talking about a pineapple, then what all parts of a pineapple can you use and reuse to make different components of, right? For example, if you're processing a pineapple, it's not just the inner pulp, which is used to make it, slices, but you can also use peels and also crowns to make basically concentrates for preserving pineapple, right? So it's all about extracting the most value out of the food item. For supermarket supply chains, once so this extraction basically becomes difficult because it's usually too late for a supermarket chain to reuse the food which is going to get lost, right? So I think the solution is to find ready alternative supply chains. Supermarkets should be linked to food producers so that if they know that a batch of tomatoes is going to go bad very soon before reaching the store, it is redirected to a food processing unit.
Terrific, thank you. We've got questions that's actually come in for a few people, including Shinji and Glenn, who asked, particularly in Southeast Asia, what part of the value chain should we be focusing on? So should we be focusing on post-harvest? Should we be focusing on the supply chain? Should we be focusing on consumer reduction of waste? Now, obviously, it's a complicated question, and it varies by country. And typically, we see in developing countries, there's a lot more at the post-harvest and supply chain side, and then with developed countries, we see a lot more at the kind of consumer end as kind of a generalization. But I'm just keen to get, and maybe this starts, I guess, more with Tanmay and Alan, but Aidan, feel free to jump in too if you have a view. Where would you say that some of the biggest opportunities look like from a Southeast Asia perspective of tackling food waste?
Right at the start, I think that there's opportunity all the way up and down the supply chain. But a couple of the key challenges we have in Southeast Asia are that the supply chain for food and the value chain for food is not the same in every country, and rules cross-country borders can be varying as well, so they present challenges. The cold chain, for example, isn't brilliantly established in every country, so there's major opportunity for food there. Where the cold chain is not robust, the potential for food losses is very high, and the ability to get good quality produce all the way through the supply chain suffers. So I think that the big hit ticket items are there. And then in the developed countries, we've got more of the behavioural stuff at the further end of the supply chain, where we will see more evolved solutions like lifestyle-oriented pieces, cook-in packaging, microwavable packaging, that type of thing.
Terrific.
Yeah. So yeah, I would just add that you're absolutely right, Alan, that in Southeast Asia, the problem is more around food loss than food waste. Because we have seen that consumers don't typically at least want to waste, and there is more acceptability.
Sorry, Tanmay, just at an entry point, could you just explain that definition difference? Because I think that's an important one that sometimes we talk about the same thing, but how, food loss versus food waste. Just talk us through what we mean by that.
So food loss is referred to the degradation of food when it happens in the supply chain before it reaches the consumer's shopping basket. Right, so anywhere from the farm to warehouses of companies to the like the stores, including the stores itself. So all that is food loss. The degrees of food loss vary a lot depending on the country and its supply chain. It's lesser in developed countries, more so in developing countries. It goes as high as 21%. For certain regions, and as for Southeast Asia, it's quite it's somewhat low, close to 13%. When we refer to food waste happens at the consumer's end. So after a shopper buys food, whether it's fresh or packed, when it's wasted and not consumed, so that is food waste.
Sure. Thanks. And yeah. Tanmay, you were going to say where you thought some of the biggest opportunities lied?
No, so I think Alan already mentioned most of the points. I would just like to emphasize again on the farmer side. So if more interventions can be done at the farm gate itself, so we need more pack houses. We need more sorting and grading at the farm stage itself, right? So I think aggregators play a bigger role in Southeast Asia. And then I'm referring more to the producers, the producing countries like your Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, right? So I think farmers need to be more empowered so that the food is segregated early on and it doesn't lead to losses down the supply chain.
Interesting. Yeah, we're Alpha Beta. We're currently working with the Indonesian government and UNDP on Indonesia's circular economy strategy, and it's interesting on the food waste analysis that's been done so far. The overall opportunities at the moment show that food waste could be more than halved, and the vast majority of those opportunities are in reduction of post-harvest food waste and reduction of supply chain food waste. So it's not to say that there's not things that can be done at the consumer and post-consumer side, but it's interesting when we see a country like Indonesia that the heavy lifting, if you like, of the opportunity is really in those upstream components.
Right.
I want to tackle another question, which is around what do we think about industry and government partnerships in this area? So I remember hearing a story that a friend said that where we are with plastic waste is basically where we were with climate change at the turn of the century. We basically knew it was a problem, but we didn't quite have the fact base of where we should start. I kind of feel like food waste is even at slightly earlier stage than where we are with plastic waste. We've got pretty strong momentum. We've got frameworks that are looking about industry, government, shared split responsibilities across the value chain. It feels a bit like food waste. We're still gathering the data. FAO has some data there, but we've got gaps for specific countries. There's still not quite an awareness of how we bring industry and government together and where the burden should lie. I'd love to get each of you just to comment. How do you see that, and what do you see as the right model as we go forward of a true sort of industry, government, civil society partnership that's going to tackle this issue? It's a big question, I know I'm asking, but love to get your views. And maybe, Aidan, I'll start with you. Give us a bit of a perspective from your end, and particularly how you see it from Northern America.
Sure. Well, I think there's something that's true, in all the territories in which we work, and we do operate fairly globally already, which is, to comment on your point, which I think is a very prescient point, all the regulations that you see regarding what's to be done with food are always about what you can apply to it, or how you can package it, or what you can label it or market it as. And none of them say anything about what happens once they go through the supply chain, right? So I'm not familiar with a whole lot of legislation, and the few pieces that I can point to are very, very nascent regarding what a waste mandate might look like, or what a utilization mandate might look like for a farmer. So you have a curious problem where regulatory influence tends to be a negative in this space, and there's reasons for it that are perfectly legitimate, human health and safety being foremost amongst them. But at the same time, that has allowed a system to propagate that has no inherent value placed on articles that are wasted. So if you think about the analogy, you use the climate change analogy, and we came up with a system for this, and that's carbon taxing, which is not a great system, but it is a functioning system to a certain extent and attaches economic value to the concept of waste. I think that any government or NGO policy that's going to be successful in mitigating any element of that is going to have to recognize that particular difficulty. You're going to have to find a way to attach a value to the discard that's outside of what we think of as traditional private business value. So a great example here in the U.S. in particular is farm subsidies. The government typically pays producers both to overproduce and to not produce. And so you have to ask yourself the question, okay, how does that system play into where does the food go and who gets how much and how is the food wasted? I think the international component is also quite challenging. Many of these supply chains are inherently international. In the Americas, for example, we tend to think of them as one market. North America certainly is the North Hemisphere version of that and produces from approximately May to October. And then South America produces from approximately August through April. And that's how you create one market. But now you're talking about 15 different countries interacting. So it's far more challenging. So I think there's got to be a lot of international influence to get that where it needs to be. And I think that the number one focal point needs to be creating good policy around the economic and climate implications of what waste is.
Terrific. Thanks, Aidan. Alan, over to you.
Yeah, look, you made a really good point, and I tend to agree with you that as a problem, it's far behind other problems we have in terms of management. From how it can be improved, or from a government and interaction point, typically we see governments interact in one of two ways. It's a kind of carrot approach or a stick approach. we'll give you an incentive to do better, or we're going to tax you if you don't do better. And I think that we're not even at that point. But I liked Aidan's point that we need to assign a value to it somehow, because if the food, particularly as it gets to a waste point, has a value, then we'll start to take some real action around how we deal with it. And I think that's probably key to some good outcomes.
Terrific, thank you. And Tanmay, your thoughts?
So I think it starts with the companies themselves, the food processing companies and supermarkets. It's true that in current scenario, nobody actually knows how much food that they're throwing away in the supply chain. And there's a saying in my world, you can't control anything if you don't measure it, right? So I can stick my neck out and say that 95% of the companies don't even know how much they are throwing out at various stages of their supply chains. So I think it's first, the companies need to be honest and be very diligent in basically monitoring what they are doing with their food. The governments should, and this may sound funny or far-fetched, but the governments should find a mechanism to monitor the dumping grounds where the food is being dumped.
And Fraser, if I could just jump on Tanmay's point real quick, because he just reminded me, I think his business in particular is oriented towards helping to solve this problem. We talked a little bit about secondary markets here, and I think Alan also kind of hinted at this. We had a really strange occurrence happen in the United States during the COVID process, which was a massive surplus of food that got dumped, and also a massive demand simultaneously from food banks and other institutions that would serve as secondary markets. And those two concepts never got linked by the public government. And so there's a recent article from The Guardian on it, New York Times. I mean, it's almost a laughable situation that the government was comically inequipped to solve. But if you look at a company like Tanmay's, that's exactly where those secondary markets are so important, is being able to connect those pieces. And I don't think it's a concept that requires massive amounts of government funding or even political action. But I do think that connecting those semi-public bodies is definitely a responsibility of private industry. So I laud that statement. I think it's a very correct statement.
Terrific. Well, look, first I want to thank all of you for your time today. Obviously we could have kept talking for hours on this. It's a huge topic, but I think in this short period of time we learned a lot already. I guess, and my sort of learnings from this is, one, it's a big issue. It's only going to get more important as we go. We're probably at an earlier stage of thinking about how to tackle it, but there are some really innovative solutions out there, including each of your own companies. And there's a real question about how do we scale up these solutions to match the severity of the problem we face. So, Aidan, Alan, and Tanmay, I want to thank you for your time. Apologies to Aidan. I know you wanted to play the guitar for us, but we ran out of time. So maybe there's a different session later on where we could exclusively hear Aidan's work during lockdown. But for now, yeah, exactly. But for now, thank you to all our panelists. And Yvonne, I'll throw it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fraser, and thank you for your questions. I'll see you again in just 3 hours' time for the last in our series of 6 FIA Dialogues editions. At 2 this afternoon, our subject is again most topical: plastics and packaging. How will plastics and circularity commitments be met in a post-COVID-19 world? We will have expert insights, debate, and the chance to have your questions answered live at 2. And please make a note in your calendar to join me again for the launch of FIA TV's Food for the Future program on August 12. And a reminder that you can view all the FIA Dialogues editions, including today's, by going to FIADialogues.com. But until I see you again at 2 today, goodbye for now.